Okay, so in phase 2, now you know all of your learning targets. You've got them all written out. You've got those accompanying language arts standards written out and all of those I can statements. Now you have to determine how you're going to teach them and then put some finishing touches on the assessments. And when you teach them, we're going to be looking for some specific things for you to implement. So we're going to talk a little bit about core program practices and how you can implement those. And those of us that are familiar with the Boise School District core practices will have an easy time with this. Some of you in the Boise district might even see these hanging up in your rooms. We'll talk a little bit about that and where you can find them. But are you able to implement a variety of instructional strategies and show some different types of teaching in your unit? We're going to look, I said, between the alignment between your teaching, your learning targets, and your assessment. And we're going to talk about using differentiation strategies in your lesson as well and what that's going to look like. Oops, sorry, I went ahead. All right, so when you are planning your scope and sequence, you're going to start out by thinking about the chunks that you need to, the pieces and the parts that you are going to need to get to teach all of those learning targets and tie them together. So most of the time, lesson 1 is going to be some kind of introductory lesson. How are you going to hook the kids into the topic? You might be doing your pre-assessment. You might be assessing their dispositions. Things, for the topic, things like that might be happening in that first lesson. And the way the template works, it's designed to guide you through the different steps and strategies we want to see that you're able to do. So here you're going to place your I can statements. You're going to place your learning target that goes with your lesson, as well as any language targets you have here. Okay. And then it asks you about instructional strategies. So how are you going to teach this lesson? And here you're going to bullet point out your lesson. So we're going to see some bullet points. These are the strategies I'm using. This is what I'll kind of do first, second, third. It doesn't have to be a novel. It's just some basic bullet points, but you should be able to name the instructional strategy you're using, or at least describe it so that we can tell what it is and if it actually matches your target. So if you have a knowledge target, I'm expecting to see a lesson that helps kids acquire the knowledge that you want them to have. So they have to match. If I see a performance target, then I'm probably going to see you modeling and having the kids practicing. Okay, it's going to be a different type of lesson. Okay, the next part really throws some people for a loop. So this is where you're going to talk about your differentiation strategies. And you need to be specific. So you will remember when we've talked about differentiation, we talked about it in our for our secondary candidates, we talked about it in 301 and 302. And in our elementary and related programs, we talked about differentiation in EdSIPS 430. And what you're needing to do here is not just describe what you're going to do, but you need to name your strategies. So for a whole class strategy for your first lesson, you're going to tell us in this particular, okay, this is like we are learning about the topic. We're gaining some basic knowledge, and I'm going to have kids doing some reading. They're going to read some articles. And your whole class differentiation could potentially be, you're going to differentiate the content by readiness by having 3 different reading levels of this article. that you've passed out to kids. Okay. It may be that you're going to differentiate the content by process, and maybe you've set up learning centers around the room where kids are going to go listen to a story about the topic. They're going to go to the next station and they're going to see some primary sources on the topic. They might go to a station and they might use some manipulatives. So you have to name your whole class strategy. What are you differentiating? And we'll talk more about that later. We'll also talk about technology. What ISTE standard did you use? And you can't just use one. So you need to be in the ISTE standards for technology. You need to be showing us that you can engage the kids in multiple standards through using technology in multiple ways. You'll name your assessment, formative and summative. Maybe this lesson only has a formative. That's fine. Okay. But it sure should match your learning target. If you have a knowledge learning target, we would expect to see a recall and remember knowledge type assessment strategy. And then here you'll list all the resources that you need. Okay, and now let's look at some of these pieces and parts in more detail. And accompanying your unit plan, one of the things you probably don't know yet, but is when you upload your unit plan to TaskStream, you will also simultaneously upload 2 full lesson plans. Any of the lessons, you're going to write 2. You don't have to write out all 14 lessons on the template that you're about to teach, but you can write out, you can however many lessons you have, but you certainly can, you're going to write out 2. Okay. And then you'll post those with your unit plan.
Sherry, for that, do we need to link them in our unit plan, or do we just upload them to TaskStream with like the date that we taught it?
So what you'll do is TaskStream only allows you to upload things all at once.
Okay.
So when you have to have the 2 lesson plans done before you start.
Yeah.
And then what you'll do is at a certain point, I'm going to tell you, we're going to get to a certain point where I'm going to say, upload it to TaskStream now. You're going to all have this uploaded to TaskStream. You're not going to be done teaching.
Okay. Okay. Awesome.
Okay. So you'll do all of that at one time. Because the reflection on what you change, that's all going to come in the next part. Okay. So I talked about integrating core practices into your SPAT. And so we just talked a little bit about the technology ISTE standards. If you Google ISTE standards, you're certainly going to find them. But if you look at your formative observations, you will see that we have been checking off where you use ISTE standards. And we're using kind of child-friendly language in our ISTE standards that we have on your formatives. You may use those, or you may go into the standards and actually cut and paste the standard you're addressing. I like to see at least 3 different ones used. Okay, engaging kids in technology, and a PowerPoint isn't meeting the ISTE standards. You've all had such great experience this semester with remote learning or online learning. I am sure all of you can come up with at least 3 different ways. It can be an assessment. It could be something like a Kahoot. It could be something like an interactive map. It could be something like they're doing some research on their Chromebooks. It could be that you're showing a video. All those things could be possibilities. Okay. We'll talk about the language targets in a little bit. And then there's these overall core program practices that we do also look at your formative assessments. But how are you tending to equity in your unit? Are you setting high expectations and using those appropriate and diverse learning tools? Student assumption of responsibility, and are you demonstrating appropriate content knowledge? And again, if you're wanting to become more familiar with those, you would look at our formative assessment because we're always checking those off for you. So there's some lists and some things to think about overall. But then we're also going to be looking at things like engaging qualities. And in our student teacher folder, I think it's in the SPAT folder. If it's not, I'll put it in there. There is an entire list of engaging qualities. So I would suggest you go in there and make sure, the research really tells us that we should have 3 in every single lesson, but for sure go shopping in there. What are the engaging qualities? How many have I used? Okay. Things like high yield practices we want to see you using. I have created a list for you. So it's almost like there's this shopping list of instructional strategies that you could look at and use that will help you to think about, how can I demonstrate that I know how to use these effective practices in my teaching? So if you don't see them in our folder, just email me and I'll send them out to everybody. Okay, just so you have that nice, beautiful shopping list. Okay, and we talked a little bit about alignment when you're designing the instruction right now. And I talked about, I can identify the stages of a butterfly life cycle. That is a knowledge standard, correct? Okay, I can identify, you need to learn how. So instruction that might match is this teacher's going to read aloud an informational text that shows the stages of the butterfly. Going to have students make and label a diagram for practice. And then later the assessment is going to be, they're going to actually draw and label the life cycle of a butterfly. So the practice matches the assessment. The assessment matches the type of target. So they got this beautiful alignment. Okay. Okay. I talked about how important it is that you have a differentiation whole group strategy. And then you can include, if you're using small groups that day, don't have a whole class, just like, what are my small groups doing? You can do it there. You also every single day you have to write down what differentiation you're going to provide for your 3 students. Okay, and you have to show on the rubric. If you look at our rubric, you have to show all different kinds of differentiation. You cannot just differentiate the content by readiness. Okay, that can't be the only thing you do. So think about how you can show things like, I'm differentiating the content by by learning profile, by having different types of stations or different types of ways. Some days we're going to draw and create diagrams. Maybe we're going to build. Maybe we're going to write. Maybe we're going to answer questions, giving kids choice for interest wherever you can. So make sure, go back to your book that you have about differentiated instruction. Find some specific strategies in there that you can pull right out of your book. I think most of you have this book. What'd you do with it? If you're secondary and you don't have this book and you need it, let's figure out how to get it in your hands, or I can get you some resources. Okay. And last, we want to talk about language targets, because this is something you really can't determine. To be honest with you, you really can't determine language targets until you have your scope and sequence, because you don't know what kind of language you're going to ask kids to use. So I am going to actually stop sharing here for a minute so that we can unpack the pieces and parts and let you ask questions about what we just talked about. So what that we just talked about, might you have questions on? What can I help you with? Yeah, Mara.
So for on the part of the scope and sequence where it says lesson like 1 through 8, more or less than 8, can that basically be kind of aligned with the assessment plan of figuring out like our SLOs 1 through ever many we need?
Yep.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you can just look at that document again and it probably will really guide you. Okay. Yeah, Kimberly.
I wrote down a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay, so the first one I had was, I think I heard you mention that we should have 3 ISTE standards. Was that for each lesson that we teach, or was that for the entire unit?
That's a great question, Kimberly. You should have at least 3 good demonstrations across your unit. You could use of different standards. So maybe if kids are, for instance, if kids are collaborating on a research project and they're using their their Chromebooks, that would be representative of one of the ISTE standards. It may be you use that every day because there's this like link, but 2 other places you need to think about, where could I use this? So one of them has to do with assessment. So maybe you have a Kahoot one day, and one of them has to do with differentiation. Sometimes your differentiation and your technology could potentially be the same thing, right? You could be demonstrating it by having different on like computer, setting up different activities for different kids based on learning profile, based on interest, based on readiness. And kids would go to different activities on the computer. So it's across your unit.
Okay.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
And there could be a day where there's no technology. That's totally fine.
Okay. That was
You don't have to have technology every day. We just need to be able to feel confident. And of course, your group is very special because I'm already actually confident because I've seen you teaching the last 2 semesters with technology. But imagine if you hadn't had the COVID experience, you could essentially leave without actually ever planning a lesson with technology, right? Like, and we can't let you escape like that. So this section should actually not be so tricky for you. You could use Nearpod. You could, just think about all the stuff you've been using, if that helps. If you're working with really young children and you're doing things like literacy stations and things like that, you could, like the kids are on the iPad all the time doing things like that, right? So just think about how to get the technology in their little hands. Okay. Kimberly, you had more questions, right?
I just had one other one. So you mentioned that if we don't have like a whole group instruction for differentiation, we could just do the small group. Is it okay if we don't have like a small group differentiation for every lesson too, or should there always be a small group differentiation for each lesson?
I would contend that you should have a fairly good reason for putting kids in small groups if you're going to do the exact same thing with every group. So like when you are working and your reason could potentially be, I need to be closer to the kids, or I need to have a small, but it's an opportunity to group kids intentionally and change up how you deliver the instruction based on the kids in the group. So I think it's small group is a great opportunity to be able to explain, I'm going to meet with the children in 3 groups, or my students in 3 groups. Group 1, we're all working towards the same exact learning target. But here's what I'm doing for group 1, here's what I'm doing for group 2, and here's what I'm doing. And math is a really super great example of that. So if you think about Bruner, right, and his different representations in math, like you might have the kids that are working at a more symbolic level, and then kids that are working, like in a more concrete space. So that's a great use of differentiated instruction.
Hey, Sherry, I have a quick, just
Yeah.
to interject. I know like in our school, we had a staff meeting and we talked about, pods, which we're calling learning teams. And
Mhm.
so I know our student teachers are going to be a little bit limited in small
Yeah.
groups. They might have to do those in different ways or, silent
Mhm.
conversations and things like that. But just know, like Kim and people who are in our school, especially, and that you're going to have to kind of conform to whatever your school has said is going to happen with your pods. But you can still get creative and do other types of conversations. But
No, that's a great point. Your grouping, perhaps by readiness, could potentially be limited. You could still offer different choices in the small pods or groups, but you could also do whole group.
right.
Or a pod could differentiate for themselves. Like when we think about differentiating by interest, right? So you could differentiate the process by interest, and each pod could make a decision about what topic they would like to work on, like a topic within a topic, right? Or they might make a decision about what kind of product they want to make, or they might make so there's ways to, I think, still do it. But Patty makes a really good point. You will be limited if your kids are assigned pods and they can't move.
I was going to ask the same thing or say the same thing. And also, as far as like stations go, like it's hard to move them from one section of the room to another and sanitize everything in between. And so
Mhm.
stations might be difficult as well.
Yep, you'll have to be really creative about that as well. Like if that's a tool you were trying to use, right? How do you do that during COVID? And maybe it's virtual. Maybe these stations actually happen inside their Chromebooks.
I also have another wonder about that. Like, I don't know, they've been on their Chromebook so much. I wonder if it would be more beneficial now that they're in person to have them having less screen time. But that was just something I was considering incorporating into my SPAT.
All things you have to think about. They're going to be hungry for touching, feeling, right? All those things. So stations, instead of kids rotating, maybe you need enough of the station for everybody, and everybody's station is in a baggie. And then maybe if they don't like maybe day one they take a baggie, and then day two they choose a different station that's all in a baggie. So it's like just getting creative about how you set it up. It may be harder, and we have to take it with a grain of salt. Like, everybody's going to have to, you can only do what you can do in your context, but you can also be super creative about how you do it. So but again, you have to follow the rules and do what you do. And so each day you're not going to have small group and whole group. It might just be, and there could potentially be a day that you don't need to differentiate the lesson because of the way the lesson is actually set up. So look at the rubric and be able to show some, I'd rather see, like in a unit that's got, let's say it's got 15 lessons, and you show, 6 really solid examples of differentiation that maybe go across a couple of days or something like that. That's fine too. Okay, but you definitely need to have differentiation for student A, B, and C. And it cannot be the same thing every single day. People love to do that. I'll give Johnny more attention. Lesson 2. I'll give Johnny more attention. Lesson 3. I'll give Johnny more attention. It's like really, really think about their learning needs and the lesson you're teaching. How do you need to adapt that instruction based on that student's needs? And the types of lessons will be different every day. So what they need is different. Okay. All right. More questions.
Sherry, I had emailed you, and I'm not sure if you already answered this and if I missed it in the very beginning, but when we're doing our sequencing, do we need to include our pre-assessment as like day one? Like, let's say my day one or lesson one is me just giving them the pre-assessment, and then they're just to see what they know. Is that my lesson 1?
You can make that lesson 1. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
And then how do you hook them right after? You give the poor kids a pre-assessment. They don't know half the stuff on it. And then right after that, it's like, how could you build excitement for this thing you're going to do tomorrow? I know that was rough, but by the time we're done, you're going to know this stuff. This is why it's so exciting. Okay, good questions. Okay, now hold on to your seatbelt, fasten it, because now we're going to go to language targets. And I know you've seen language targets before in different classes. Different people talk about it in different ways. And I'm going to try to make it.
These have little icons on them, and you can like mouse over them.
I think you have to mute. There you go.
So yeah.
All right. We're going to try to just like 100-foot view at first, but then I'm going to be kind of prescriptive. Okay. I'm going to kind of do a little hand holding here because it's the process that's really important. It's the thinking that we talked last week. We talked last time about habits of mind. This is a habit of mind that I want you to always embrace. And so I'm going to try to make it a little less technical. First, I'll be technical. Then I'm going to be a little less technical. And then we're going to practice. So you all are going to need access at some point to your SPAT template and be able. So I'm going to give you right now, I'm going to give you just a minute to make sure you have your templates at hand. And we'll do some of this work with we're going to go do some of this work with our liaisons after we do one together. So we're going to do at the end, we'll end up doing like an I do, we do, and then a you do, still really scaffolded in your small groups. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share while you're opening. Maybe I can just stretch it out. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stretch it out for you. Okay. So we've given you the basics in your classes before. How much you remember, I am not sure. But when we think about why we're writing language targets and we're thinking about language demands, what we're really thinking about is during each lesson, what reading, writing, speaking, and listening am I going to ask kids to do today? And how do I have to scaffold that as a teacher? So what is it I need to do to help all students in my class to really understand the language, but at the same time, specifically for our language learners, what's going to trip them up? And it's almost what it really is it's a form of explicit teaching and a form of differentiation that really helps every learner in your class. So it's not just for language learners in that sense. It's going to help everybody understand the lesson more clearly. So there's 3 levels of academic language that we might ask kids to engage in during our lessons. First is the word and phrase level. And on your template, you see that it says word level. What we mean by the word level is the vocabulary of the content. And I know that most of you teach vocabulary up front. So you're going to teach that content area, content specific vocabulary very explicitly. You're going to make sure that it's perhaps up on the wall. Maybe you make a word wall of the special vocabulary that students need during this unit so that it's visual, that it's up there. Maybe they're writing it in their math journal. Whatever it is, you want to make sure that you identify what that vocabulary is that you need to teach and that you have it accessible to the kids in the room. We're also talking about, I call them, I know they have a different name somehow, I call them operational words. So if I'm going to ask kids to observe in a lesson, My language learners may not know what observe means. If I'm going to ask kids to synthesize, analyze, okay, I experiment, I have to teach what those words mean. And a great time to do that might be when you're unpacking your learning targets. I've seen teachers, I've seen a lot of you really effectively do that. Today, our learning target is I can observe, blah, 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 and write down my observation, something like that. And then I hear some of you saying, what does it mean to observe? Right? You can sometimes unpack those words and see them right in your targets, those directional words. Okay, so those are the two things I would say that you should focus on. And then there's also, like, we talk about tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 vocabulary. So just any words in a passage that kids are about to read that you think might not be familiar to them. You want to unpack those words too for kids. We also have the sentence level. In sentence level, we mean, what is the sentence structure that kids might be writing? I often think about this in terms of writing, producing language. I think about this in terms of writing, and I think about it in terms of talking. Okay, what are some sentence types that kids might be using? Are they going to use sequential sentences? Are they going to use, like, where they're using like first, next, last? Is it compound sentences? Are they explanatory? I like explanatory sentences. Am I going to ask somebody to explain something? Are they descriptive sentences? Maybe I'm going to ask kids to describe. A lot of times these words come straight out of your targets. Okay. So for sentence level, I need to identify that because I might like to make some sentence frames for my kids to demonstrate how this type of sentence sounds or looks. Okay. And then the last one is the one that's hardest for everybody. And that is the discourse level. This is not about talking. This is about organizational structure. It is about the genre that you're asking kids to read or write in and how it's put together. And I'll give you an example. So if I'm going to have kids read some informational text out of their textbook to gain some knowledge, okay, the discourse level is informational text. And the things kids probably need to know are things like, well, my textbook has headings. It has captions. Okay. So for my language learners and for everybody, I want to make that really apparent. For you to really learn from this reading, I want you to use the headings. I want you to understand that you should look at the pictures. You should read the captions. Okay. All that's important. So it's really just describing. It could be that kids are reading a narrative and you want to talk about story elements. It could be that you're asking kids to write some, they're going to write an essay. Well, then they need to know the 5-paragraph structure. Maybe you're going to ask kids to give their opinion. Well, then they need to understand opinion writing. So discourse level, you could just scratch that out. And you could just write down genre. And what do I need kids to know about this specific genre before they engage in either reading, writing, speaking, or listening? A math genre here, a discourse level for math, I think, is being able to provide a rationale for your math solution. What is a good math rationale sound like? If kids are reading word problems, then I would unpack what a word information is in a word problem so that kids could understand it. So word problem is a genre. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing just a minute here because I want to talk a little bit about how it looks in your template. So I recommend that students under the word level, I would recommend that you create a little chart that has 3 columns. And the first column, I would call it, I would label the first column, I think, content vocabulary. The second column, I would say directional words, something like that. And the third column, I might call like tier 3 vocabulary or tough vocabulary. And then on the far left side, you know, your labeling, it just might be lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3, lesson 4, lesson 5. And maybe think about the vocabulary that you need to introduce or reinforce during that lesson. And you could just drop that table right in there. When you're done planning your scope and sequence, right under word level, you could just drop that table in. Okay. You could add potentially 2 more columns if you wanted to, and you could have a column that says sentence type. And if there were any kind of sentence structures that you really wanted to point out, like you're going to have kids write some sentences, like an exit ticket would be a good time when maybe they only are going to write a couple of sentences. It could be this is the time when you're going to use sentence stems. It could be that you need to teach something like, you know, you're going to have some sentences that say da 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 because da 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 da. You need to identify that. And then the last thing, of course, is to name the discourse. Is it informational text they're going to read? Are they going to write opinion piece? Are they going to turn and talk to their neighbor and give a rationale for their math problem? What does that look like? What do they need to know? So actually the whole thing could just be a chart. Could just be lesson 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What's the vocabulary I have to teach? Are there any particular sentence structures that kids are going to read, write, speak, or listen? And what's the genre that they'll be reading, writing, speaking, or listening? And then you would know what the language expectations are for each and every one of your lessons. And you're not going to put every little thing down. You're going to pick what's the most important thing today. What would trip kids up the most? Does that make sense to people? Okay, I think I might, hang on, it's possible. Okay, so here is an example that my friend Margaret gave me. And so Margaret has her candidates put in this section of language demands. She has them put the activity. So essentially, let's say this was like lesson 1, right? And the activity that they were going to be talking about that day is the scientific method. And she has her columns marked a little bit differently. And these students are in the ELL program. So they're like TESOL or ESL. So they're really digging in a lot deeper than you actually need to. I would just put, instead of all of these things, I would just go to the word level, the sentence level, and the discourse level. And I would have 2 word levels or 3, like content area vocabulary, any direction words I want to call out, and any really difficult vocabulary.
Sherry,
Yep.
should we be able to see this on our screen right now?
Oh, you can't see it? I'm so
No.
sorry. I'm so sorry. There you are. You're hiding behind the screen. Just a second. Thank you for calling me out. Can you see it now? Can you guys see it now?
Yes.
No? Yes, perfect. Okay. So right here where it says language demands, you can see that this student has just created a table for themselves that has the words they want to teach, something that might be happening at the sentence level, and some kind of genre feature that they want to make sure to teach. And you'll see under the sentence level, here's what I love right here, is you'll see like when they're talking about Newton's first law of exploration, the compound sentence structure they were going to use to talk to each other was the ball rolled blank centimeters on the blank surface, but rolled blank centimeters on the blank surface. And so that was a sentence stem that really demonstrated the structure of the sentence the kids were going to have to use when they talked to each other, when they turned and talked. Okay, and then you'll see here during the laws of motion under the discourse features, the student has said, oh, the reading is organized with headings, pictures, and bolded words. So I'm going to need to explain that. So yours will look different than this. I'm just suggesting that if you would like to create a table here, I think it's actually more useful to you. As far as a process goes, I think it's more useful to you as a process. Okay, so here are our 4 steps to writing a language target. Okay, the first thing you have to do, guess what? You've already done it. So it's a check mark for you already. You have written down all of your content area targets and your language targets, your ELA targets. You already know those, it's already done. And here's my example. Let's say I'm teaching a unit about Dr. Martin Luther King. And my content targets for the day are, I can describe important events in Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. I can describe beliefs about how Martin Luther King Jr. changed America. I can identify main idea and supporting details in a text. And I can support my ideas with evidence from a text. You can see that the first 2 would be my social studies content targets. And these second 2 are my ELA targets. Okay. And these are going to be the 4 targets I'm going to work with in my unit today. Step number 2, determine the language expectations. And I just showed you a table that you could drop into your plan that would really help you identify that. Okay, and this, for those 4, for the unit I'm teaching, here's a very simple thing. I'm just like, oh yeah, they're gonna watch a video. I remember that. There's going to be some class discussion. We're going to write some sentences that are explanatory, and it's going to be an essay. And I need to know like the 5-paragraph essay. Okay, I'm going to read this book, I Am Martin Luther King. So I've got to go through and I've got to figure out what vocabulary is in this book that I'm going to need to explain. How is the book laid out in its text structure so I can explain it to kids. In my writing, I have these sentences. So I have kind of figured out what the language demands are. I prefer to use that chart. I'm going to actually replace this slide with my chart slide next time. Okay. If I dig deeper into my resources that I'm using, I've decided that my vocabulary that I need to teach is really segregation, civil rights, equality, claim, evidence. Okay, so here's that vocabulary I want to focus on. Sentence structure, okay. It's this complex sentence, which is going to be like blank. I believe that blank. So I kind of created a little sentence stem here for myself. And the discourse features have to focus on organizational structure. Okay, and last is how do I write them? It's really, this is a math problem. Those of you that are math people are gonna love this because it's an equation, okay? So it's simply this, okay? What you have to do is take your language demand, plus your content stem, and you are going to come out with a great language target. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples. I showed you my content targets. I can describe important events in Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. Here are my language demands at the word, sentence, and discourse level, and I'm going to put one together for you. So I can describe important events in Martin Luther King's life by using, those are the two words you have to remember, by using content area vocabulary such as segregation, civil rights, equality, claim, or evidence. I can describe important events in Martin Luther King Jr.'s life by using complex sentences that state a claim supported by evidence. And then I would say like such as, and then put the sentence stem. Okay. So we are going to try a couple. And here's what I would like you to do. I would like you to look at my list here. Hang on. I can't get that last one. There. Okay. So I would like you to go ahead and look at this list. And who would like to be brave and try to put one together for us? Who would like to try? Let's try the last one. I could support my ideas with evidence from the text by doing what?
Citing information found in the text to help defend my reasoning or evidence.
Yes, and I would even see, I'm sorry. I would even use more of this discourse one. I would even say I could support my ideas and evidence from text by understanding main ideas, supporting details, discussion. See how I'm using the language from right here? Yes. Okay. I can identify main idea and supporting details from a text. Okay. By using complex sentences, stating a claim supported by evidence based on blah, blah, blah. Okay, thank you, Mara, for being brave. So here's a couple of examples. Okay, so the content target was I can solve an elapsed time problem. Okay, the language demands were comparative words such as similar, different, or using a complex sentence, blank and blank are similar because, and you just put them together. I can compare different approaches to solving a elapsed time problem using either comparative words or in a complex sentence. So you're just putting the two together. Okay. So the content target is I can identify the key information in a weather report from a news source. Okay. What's the language? By using weather-related terms such as partially cloudy, predict, precipitation. Okay. I could identify by using a variety of introductory phrases for each part of the weather. So you're just putting your language demand together with one of your targets. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put you into some groups. Let me stop sharing. Okay, before we go to groups, I'm going to have you each look at your own SPAT. And I'm going to have you pick a content target. Okay, and let's just pretend it's the vocabulary. So at the word level, are there a few words that you might be able to jot down that you potentially might be teaching in your unit? Okay, and could you match it with one of your content targets. And let's see if anybody would like to take a stab at it. So you're going to take one of your I can, and it might even be an I can describe. And then maybe by using, and then give me some of your content target your content words you might be using. Let me see if I can look at somebody's SPAT. Would anybody like to share their screen and I'll help you put it together? I think you can all share. And I'll help you, I promise. Okay, Mara, you want to share your screen?
Oh, I thought I just was gonna give it a stab and say
Give
what
it
it
a
was.
stab. Give it a stab.
I can identify the meaning of the preamble to the Constitution by breaking down or like identifying what one of the phrases in it means, something like that.
By describing one of the phrases
Yeah.
in that. So you would be looking at the discourse level, kind of, and you'd be looking at the phrase or the sentence level.
Yeah.
And breaking down the different phrases inside of the preamble.
Yes, that's the point.
Good. Okay,
Thank
anybody
you.
else want to try one? Or share your screen and I'll help you do it. Okay, no one's feeling very confident. That's okay. That's my formative assessment of the situation. So here's what I want you to do instead. In your SPAT, what I want you to do is take the time to create that language demand chart. So as you're creating your lessons, you just might not be quite ready for this. As you're creating your lessons, I want you to jot down, is there any content vocabulary I'm going to teach? Is there a particular sentence structure kids will use to turn and talk to each other? Okay. Is there a discourse feature involved in their reading or writing today? Complete that chart first. Okay. And then we will revisit the next part later. Okay. So don't worry about it. And it doesn't have to slow you down. Just get that language demand chart first. It's actually way more important than the language targets themselves. Because once you actually see the chart, you'll know what you have to teach. Right? You're going to figure that out. You're going to be like, oh, I got to teach that. They can't describe it. I've asked them to describe something. They can't describe it without knowing the vocabulary. So I can help you easily create the learning targets after you create your learning demand, your language demand chart. Okay? So you're going to work on your scope and sequence. You're going to work on your language demand chart. You're going to share it with me so I can look at it and help you. Then you're going to get ready to teach. It's very exciting. Okay? All right. We are not going to do any language demand activities when we meet with our liaisons. You're just going to discuss questions, whatever you want. I don't think you're ready until you might want to talk about the language demand chart and how you might create that for some of the lessons you've been looking at. But I think until you make the chart, we can't really talk about the targets. So that's okay. So you might want to talk about your scope and sequence with your liaison. You might want to talk about kids returning to school, whatever it is your liaison has on their mind right now, you guys can use for that talking time. Okay, questions before we go into liaison groups? Nope. Okay, here we go. Okay. If you are in Rich's group, you are in number 1. Okay, Kaylee, you're in number 2. Miko, you're in number 3. Patty, you're in number 4. And everybody else stays with me. You may choose your breakouts. Rich, can you get in there? Do I have to help you? Oh, you got there. Okay. He's disappeared. Okay. Okay, Miko's in 3. Good. Patty, oh, she's in there. Okay. Right.
Sherry,
Yep.
could you possibly put me in the breakout room? I don't know why I'd never have the option.
Oh, I hate that. Okay. And Lauren, which room are you in?
I'm in room 1.
Perfect. Off you go.
Thank you.
Okay. Everybody else is mine. Okay. All right. Questions about all that. So what are your questions about developing your scope and sequence, about the differentiation part, about the technology part?
So I guess for me personally, so my classroom will have the pods, and since I'm teaching second grade, most of our all of our second graders, it's like 1 second grader per pod.
Okay, wait, Riley, hang on 1 second. Just 1 second.